Hello, and welcome to the seventh episode of the North South podcast with me, Andrew Hardwick, and my co-host,
Dave Allenson.
as always. Pleasure to have you, Dave.
Thanks.
How are we? How are we doing?
Special guest.
Yeah, special guest.
Good. Thanks, mate. Better than I was last week. I've been ill for like a week and a bit, which is great fun.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a. It's such. I think it's obviously for anyone who isn't located in the UK listening to this, especially the northern weather at the minute is very it's very up and down. It can't quite make its mind up. One day it's hot, one day it's cold, one day it's raining, one day it's sunny, and obviously from a bacteria standpoint and a viral standpoint, it's a bit of a breeding ground, isn't it? So everyone's down with something. But yeah, glad to hear you're better. Anyway.
Cheers.
But yeah, so today we're sort of going to go back to training a little bit. Obviously, we the last two episodes we sort of talked about sort of more the individual side of training, whether it's ownership, whether it's managing controllable factors, and just generally the sort of overlying areas of our development that we can manage ourselves. So obviously today we thought we'd delve a little bit back towards the sort of technicalities of training and look a little bit more at session design. Now, obviously, this is a little bit more coach focused, but obviously there might be some stuff in there that you as an individual can take use of and apply within your training. But obviously the idea of session design is how can we as coaches and individuals, how can we get the most out of a session or the most sort of development from a session that we have, whether it's you're coaching sort of across a full week as a gym owner, or you're just somebody who maybe coaches once, twice, three times a week as a member or a senior member of a gym. So I guess the easiest way to do this is to sort of break it down into segments, isn't it? So we'll start with a warm-up. So what are your opinions of a warm-up, Dave?
Well, now I've got my purple belt. Just don't go to them.
Just don't go to them. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think they can be very useful. I think people sometimes... I think it's an area that people fret about a little bit too much. So as long as you know why you were using the warm-up that you were using, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So people are very quick to like shit on the Gracie Barra style of, make you sick for half an hour. And I don't think that's necessarily useful. You don't want anything more that's like 10 minutes long. But the pros to the Gracie Barra style warm-up, to give it its dues, are you can do it anywhere. So you can keep your warm-up the same at competition as you can in your sessions. And for a lot of people, that's a psychological, I don't want to say like security blanket, but it's a positive start to your day of competing if it feels the same as when you're stepping on the mats. And that's often a bit that people struggle with.
It's a process, isn't it? They obviously when we look at again, we're already off on a tangent here, but when we talk about like, if you look at like factors in terms of, again, based on last episode, what things can we control going into a competition? What we want to try and do is create a similar environment as possible. So we are. There's nothing that we're experiencing that is overly new. We're not experiencing anything that's like completely untoward. Now, obviously, we can't manage everything. We don't know what the sports hall is going to look like, what the warm up facilities are going to look like, what space we're going to have, all those different things. So, what the actual Gracie warm up does do is it allows you to carry a really simple area of process into an environment that you don't know it's going to look like. So you know that you can do it anywhere, minimal space. It takes 5-10 minutes to get a good warm-up in. And again, it's that sense of familiarity. There's nothing, you're not testing anything out on the day. It's something that you've repeated multiple times, and you're just creating that idea of process. So like you said, to pay its dues. Now, I actually, I'm a big fan of the warm. Obviously, a lot of what we'll talk about today, because obviously I run sessions, if you're new to the podcast, I presume if you listened a few times, you already know this. But obviously, from a coach perspective, the warm up is something that I actually think it is grossly undervalued, but also overrated at the same time. Which is quite an interesting conundrum to have. I think it is a really effective tool for various reasons. So, it's completely dependent on what is it you're trying to get out of the warm up. So, generally speaking, to use a more sort of scientific, I guess, approach is the one that you'll always see is this idea of the ramp. So RAMP, which is quite a common sort of acronym used for warm-ups, and that stands for raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate. And in theory, what that means in the common tongue is you get moving, you get your blood but get some blood flowing, you get your heart rate up a little bit, and you generally put yourself in a position where you feel good and ready to go. That's in theory is what it is. And we can, but again, that if you read textbooks, or again, obviously you'll know this, Dave, but like when you read textbooks about ramp warm-ups, it generally gets broken down quite categorically. So it'll be like raise, do this for 5 minutes. Activate, this for 5
minutes on an assault bike, and then
and then it's mobilize, and it's in reality you don't really need that. You just need to move. You need to feel good. You need to do something that's, like I said, going to get your heart rate up. It's going to get your joints sort of moving, greasing that groove, for want of a better word, and something that's going to get you mentally as well engaged in a task and prepared to train and engage with the things that you're trying to get better at. Now, what I think is a really good strategy for coaches to have is a variable selection of warm-ups to utilize. So what I mean by that is, depending on again, because we talk about like how do we manipulate task constraints and game design and session design, but a warm-up can be a really good way of introducing an element to the class. So the way I look at it is we have three areas of warm-up, essentially. I'm making this sound more complicated than it is, but I'm just obviously trying to explain my thought process. So we have a very short and sharp and quick warm-up. That's like class before is overrun. We've not got much time. We've got loads of content to get through in the session. We need them moving and ready to go within 5-10 minutes. I have a sort of fun / game-based, not game from an ecological standpoint, like an actual game-based approach. So that'll be like that's essentially if I'm looking around the room or I'm sat in the gym before the class and everyone's a bit quiet, everyone's a bit like looks like they can't be arsed. It's like, well, let's get them moving, let's get them laughing, let's get them pissing around, basically, and just get that level of engagement back up into the mix. If I can sort of get that sense of the atmosphere before a class that everyone's not very motivated, well, let's have some fun. Let's play. Like, do you know what I mean? Like we played Bulldog last Wednesday, or it's like tug of war games, TIG, things like that. Like just daft shit. Like it's something that I think is grossly undervalued in the context of adults. It's something that's quite widely used with children. When you look at coaching kids, it's all about fun. It's about engagement. It's about them activating in a task. But we know, as obviously as strength conditioning coaches, a large portion of adults nowadays, ourselves included, we often lose that element of fun and play and engagement and silliness within training. It's always very like, oh no, it's got to be serious. Everything's got to be serious. You've got to switch on. You've got to, and it's why do we take? I'm a big believer. Is like, why do we take that out? Like, why as adults do we stop playing and exploring and messing around? Really, like using movement in different variants. And like we know, like a lot of athleticism is developed through exploration and again, like when we talk about it from a scientific standpoint in terms of like movement solutions, but that comes from engaging with a daft random task, and we have to orientate ourselves in a random way
in an environment where it also doesn't matter if you fuck it up.
It's just you're getting normal people who spent 50 hours sat at a desk moving and playing. Do you know what I mean? Like it's daft, and they have a laugh and they engage with it. So like, again, the task itself doesn't matter. Like, there's fucking endless amounts of games that you can play. Like I said, we played Bulldog last week. We played tug of war games. We've done like, I don't know, like rugby. We've played rugby. Obviously the wrestlers, if you've ever been to like a proper wrestling gym, they play like rugby, basketball. Like I've been to a wrestling class, and we played five-a-side for like 10 minutes before the class started. So it's just some daft stuff to get people engaged and get them moving. And then the final end of the spectrum is like a more, I guess, quote unquote, specific warm up. And when I mean specific, I mean we're doing something related to grappling. So like, I really like tasks where people have to apply themselves with a real degree of intensity, but the task is limited with how much they can actually do. So like no hand games. So we do loads of like no hand games. So it might be like defend a single leg with no hands. So you have to just move, and obviously they're not like fucking proper like whacking each other, but like
that's nice though.
Or like side control. So you've got to maintain side control, but you can't use your hands. Like that, just things like that obviously have a degree of crossover into skilled areas. But they're not too serious. But people have to apply themselves in the same way. Like it's that idea of utilizing the warm up. And again, those things depend on how much time we've got, what we're trying to get through in the session. Like I said, how are people's body language? How are they talking to each other when they come into the mat? Like, and just use that as like a key point from there. And I think like I said, it's grossly the amount of emphasis that gets put on a warm up is grossly overrated, but the utilization of them I also feel is grossly undervalued in terms of how you get a group of individuals engaging and moving and prepared to complete a task.
Well, there's sort of two things that you said that I like. Well, there's quite a lot there that you said that I like, but I think there's two unsung aspects of this that people don't consider. One is read the room. Too many people think, oh, I've got to write this like they're all at the Olympics and it's got to do X, Y, and Z, and I've got to tick all these boxes. As long as what you are doing raises their pulse, gets them warm, and doesn't introduce them to anything too difficult too quickly, there's not really anything you can do that's wrong. Like, there's not an optimal warm up. It doesn't exist. It's just, did you get the people in front of you warm? Are they in a good mood? They're going to be more receptive to learning if they're like happy and enjoying themselves than they are if they're pissed off and they don't want to be there, because you've opened people up to conversation. You've essentially softened their minds from like work or whatever environment that leaves them all closed off and made them more open to be engaging with this process.
For sure. And
like
I think
you said, fun's not a dirty. That's all right, but fun's not a dirty word, and people treat it like it is. Like, oh well, they don't do this at preparation for the Mundials or ADCC, and it's like, yeah, but most of us aren't fucking going, so that's absolutely fine. And they probably do plenty of this shit when it's not competition season.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I remember like back in the day when I was playing rugby, we used to have this rule of like the warm up was the period where it's like that's where you get everything out. So like if someone's obviously it's rugby, so there's all sorts of shit going on at a weekend, but like if someone's done something daft at a weekend, your warm up is that opportunity to like conversate about it. And then once the warm up's done, that's when it's like, right, now we're kicking to gear. So it provides them with that opportunity to be like, just get the shit out. Obviously in jiu-jitsu, it's an amateur sport. This is people's hobbies. So like we come to the gym to socialize. And that's your opportunity to let them socialize. You know what I mean? That's their opportunity for them to have a laugh and just get all the shit out off the chest and decompress in a way from like whatever they've been dealing with in the day. And then we move into training that gives us that opportunity that they're engaged and they're ready to go at that point. It's no longer like they're not just coming straight from work.
It's not a barrier. And I think that's where you're talking about how these are sort of undervalued. That's what matters. Like psychologically, you think our sport is, I'll say it fucking 9th time I've probably said it in this podcast, but it's complex and it's chaotic. And so you need to have your brain ready, essentially. You need to be in the right frame of mind where you are open and willing to learn. And that is not going to happen if you don't give people the space to decompress before they do the session. They'll either not learn or they'll take that space when you're not looking. So they won't do whatever thing that you've asked them to do properly, because they need to get that out. Like, some of the best teachers I ever saw were the people who could give whatever fucking naughty child space to be that for a minute, and they go, right, now can we carry on with the lesson? They're like, yeah, okay, I've got it out. And that doesn't work for everyone, but that's a huge barrier, a huge cognitive load to have in the way of doing something that's cognitively challenging, like learning jiu-jitsu. You might as well use the warm-up for that. Like, I'd sort of argue if all it does is get people a little bit warm and give them the opportunity for a chat, then it's done more than most people's like clever warm-ups ever have.
Yeah.
Especially for the groups of people that we're talking about, because you can be a bit more strict, I imagine, with all these kinds of warm-ups if you're training 6 times, or you've got 3 mini training sessions a day, or you've got 4 or whatever, because you've had that space to decompress already. But if you do this 2 times a week, 3 times a week, you need to give people that room so that they're then ready for the stuff to come.
Yeah, for sure. And this is always what makes me laugh, when people are like, oh, running round for 5 minutes is pointless. Why don't you do something specific? And then they go, the specific thing is drilling. I mean, if we've not already established that drilling is shit, then what are we having this the conversation about? But also, that is the least mentally engaging thing in the world. Yeah. Like, it just baffles me. Like, first and foremost, it's not specific. It might look specific, but it's fucking not. Second of all, you're trying to get people to engage with something. And like you said, they've just come from work. They've been stuck in traffic for 40 minutes. They're stressed out. They've got a bill to pay. The kids are fucking running around. And you go on the mat and you go, right, use your brain. And they're just like, what the fuck? And that's why everyone ends up chatting. Because
it's also why it's shit.
Yeah.
Because they just do, I'll just do like 12 shit arm bars. Right, fine, we'll have a chat while I'm doing it.
Yeah, because they're just that, like you said, that energy that they've had built up all day, whether it's mental or physical. There's no way of them just like blowing that out. Do you know what I mean? They're not getting that that energy out. They want to communicate. They want to talk to people. Like, I mean, we have it at the gym, and you see blokes come in the gym, women as well, but more blokes because obviously there are more men in the sport, and they're just like gagging to talk to somebody, and have a laugh, and like. It's all you have to do is look around and just see what's going on. Like, all they want to do is have a conversation. They want to, I don't know, it's jiu-jitsu in it. So like, someone's fucking took some mushrooms and had a big mad experience, or like someone's fucking had a scrap at the weekend. Whatever it is, do you know what I mean? Like, whatever fucking they want to talk about football or whatever. It's like you can see them gagging to have a conversation, and it's just that opportunity to be like, right, let's just get all this mental energy out and we'll focus on this task. It's like, when, I know this sounds daft, but a lot I learned about coaching, I learned from dog training, because I'm a sad bastard and find dog training really interesting. But like, if I was to take Bailey, I mean, he's old and a lazy bastard now, but like back in the day, being a Springer, if I tried to train Bailey on his walk straight away, I'm not getting anything out of him. Because he's just like full of energy. He just wants to sniff and smell and chew and chase everything that fucking moves. So it's like you need to give, when you watch like dog trainers talk about it, you don't train them straight away. You give them 10, 15 minutes, get rid of that initial burst of energy, that excitement. And then when they've settled down a little bit, then it's when you start to work. And it's the same with human beings. Like, we need to get rid of that like initial bit of like, right, what am I doing? What's going on? Like, am I doing this? Am I doing that? Am I doing that? What have I done at work? And it's like, get rid of that and then bring them back to baseline. Now we start to work towards a task that's going to help them get better. But it's interesting, actually, funnily enough, you made a really good point at the start to sort of revert back about the sort of Gracie Barra warm-up. And something to give a bit of context, we're going into our first, I don't know how it's going to go, but this is the first sort of block of competition prep that we're going into for the year. And one of the things that we're going to implement is during one of the sessions of the week, I'm going to say to them, like, I'm going to put 15 minutes on the timer. You've got 15 minutes to get yourself warm in a manner that's adequate for you. So that they're building that idea. Like, some people, it might be they want to do flow rolls, they want to do some running around. Some people might want to stretch and just do some breath work, whatever it is. But that's their 10, 15 minutes. no indication from me. It's like, right, we need to start building that process, like preparing them to be like, right, here's what could be available. You could have some mats. You might not have some mats. You'll have a little bit of space.
Yeah.
You might have loads of space. And it's like, right, how can you formulate a warm-up? Do you listen to music? Do some people make notes? Everyone's a bit different. So it's like, here's your 10, 15 minutes now to build that process that's repeatable. You can control it no matter the environment that you're in. You could practice it. So if you go to a different gym's open mat, you've got that 10, 15 minutes to get yourself into a warm, and you again reinforcing that idea of like, this is familiar, this is something I can control, this is how I know I feel good, and this is how again setting you up for success through a process based warm up.
Yeah, no, I think, to be honest, the key thing that's going to run through all of these different bits is, why are you doing it? Because if you haven't got a why, if you're just filling time, then you've wasted everyone in that room's time and your own, because you've sat down and planned something that didn't have a purpose, and then you've gone and delivered something that didn't have a purpose. So as long as you can say why you're doing what you're doing and justify it to yourself and kind of see how that's going to help people to develop, then that's fine. There's nothing wrong with using a warm-up for games. There's nothing wrong with using a warm-up to give people space to work out what their warm-up will be when they come to compete. Like, there's nothing wrong with having a short warm-up because you can run out of time. Like, all of these things work as long as you give people a little bit of space to be ready to learn, and you make sure that they're warm enough that no one comes in cold and, isn't thinking and does something stupid in the first 10 minutes.
For sure. And I think, like, I'll just counteract slightly to what you just said. Yeah. A lot of, again, slightly different topic, but a lot of development in coaching comes from self-awareness. And I think when I see that argument of like time, my first response is like, manage your time better as a coach. Like, if losing 10 minutes of a session of a warm-up means that you don't get the content out, that means you're not managing your time within a session effectively.
Yeah.
Like, it's so easy to just go, whoa, time constraint, don't have time. It's like, you do have time. You're just making an excuse because you can't manage your session well enough. Like, it's 10 minutes. That's all it takes. 10 minutes. And it's not like I said, for the majority of people, a lot of the people in your classes will probably get more out of those 10 minutes physically movement wise than 45 minutes of drilling.
Yeah.
Like, because they're anyway.
Like you were saying, it's that I haven't got time. Well, people around the country teach kids fucking, like, I've taught 14-year-olds about the Holocaust in an hour. Yeah. You've got 10 minutes. It's absolutely fine. Yeah. Other people have taught kids how to pass A-level exams in an hour. Like,
you learn to drive in an hour. And you do hour driving lesson.
Oh, we haven't got time, guys. Sorry, it's 10 minutes. Like, it just means that you're not thinking about your sessions. You're not thinking about the timings. And one of the first things that you learn on teacher training is you need to properly plan out your lesson, including timings, because then you can come back to it at the end and go, right, fuck, I'm shit at managing my timings, or I'm bad at estimating my timings and I'll get better at that. And then you come out the other side at the end where you don't even really need to think about it because you've just got an idea of roughly how long these things take. But if you don't make any effort to try and get good at managing time, then you won't be good at managing time. It's not just going to happen magically because some people have got it and some people haven't. Some people have an affinity for it and some people have to work to develop it.
Yeah, for sure. And like, if you're running out of time, again, if we're talking about the majority of gyms, if you're running out of time because of your drilling, maybe you need to shut the fuck up. Like, maybe you need to stop fucking talking and let them get on with it.
Yeah,
like, because that's the only thing. Because you're not losing time because they're drilling a technique for 5 minutes. You're losing time because you don't shut the fuck up talking for 15 minutes. Yeah. Like, just let them get on. And again, this is where we're coming on to more of the bulk of the session. But like, just let them get on with it. Like, it's again, this is we'll talk about it in a second. But we might as well move on to the main bulk of a session. Now, again, you could depending on the class that you're running. Now, if we generally assume we're going along like a more traditional model of jiu-jitsu, which in my opinion is crap, but let's assume that the majority of gyms are using it. It will your session generally, if you're an individual, you'll probably recognize this. You'll have some degree of warm up. Hopefully, you'll have 45 minutes of technical intervention, whether it's drilling, etc. And then the third part of your session will generally be into the rolling.
The bit you came for.
The bit you came for, which I don't even want to break it down because I think it's crap. But that's what your session's going to look like. Now, hopefully, and I say this hopefully, but I don't I don't hold out much anymore, is hopefully your coach has got an aim for the session. There is a goal, there is a task, and it's planned. Regardless of which method you use, I'm hoping that there's an overlying theme for the session.
And it isn't just what I thought of in the car park before I came inside.
Yeah, hopefully there is some method behind the madness. Now, interestingly, the problem is, again, depending on which way you're looking at this, depending on which method you use. So, obviously, if you're looking at this from a traditional sort of cognitive approach or IP approach, that overlying theme will be a technique. So it'll be either a series of events or a specific technique, and you'll obviously break that down into segments and start to build that up. Now that might be like a sequence of events moving from from sort of quite gross movements from, like I say, a pass to side control to the back, or it might be more specific than that. It might be like entirely focused around a back control or a back arm trapping sequence or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Now, if you're looking at it from an ecological standpoint, what I do from my coaching sessions is I have a sort of general idea of what I want to see happen. So obviously, because we don't do any drilling or any sort of technique work, I'm putting a session together based on the outcomes that I'm hoping to see. So everything that we do is catered around that. Now, there are obviously going to be skill components within that. So there might be an overlying theme to that skill component. So what can I use as an example? So last night, I'll use last night's example. So last night we looked more towards the sort of overlying theme was we were utilizing a seated guard and a passing from kneeling position. So the way that we broke that down was we were looking at the sort of gripping sequence, so making and maintaining connections to our opponent, sort of working through a hierarchy of control. So how can we get into greater positions of connection? So not just gripping the wrist, can we work to like shoulder grips, elbow grips on the inside or the outside, and then again starting to create instability, or what again, destabilization is the ecological term. I think Danaher's got some weird fucking Japanese term for it, but essentially how can we knock our opponent? Kazushi, that's the one. How can we knock our opponent off guard? And then the sort of end thing was we were trying to sort of show similarities or relationships between sweeping and or attacking the legs. So the sort of initial engagements in both those processes from a seated guard position are very, very similar. And the overlying theme was like, can we draw comparisons between the two? So when we're making decisions, if we can't sweep, can we attack a leg, and just draw in a little bit of like comparison between the two. So that's what my aim is from the session. I want to sort of, what I'm trying to see is, can guys again make and manage connections? Can they make dominating grips, whether it's on the inside or the outside? Can they coordinate or orientate themselves to manage posture? Are they managing timing and are they managing that instability? That's the stability element. Are they offsetting their opponent, etc., etc.? And then what I'm looking at from a coach perspective is, how are they then making decisions relative to the attack that they're going towards? Like, are they again using that to finish the sweep and end up in a reverse position, or are they using that energy to like penetrate the inside with the legs and attach at the hip or constrain the hip in some way? And everything that we then do within the session is based around the overlying theme. And the games that we play are manipulated and based off key topics. And obviously we use a general structure, and then we tweak it and discuss and feedback and all that sort of shit goes into it as well. But we can start to see how the session will play out is dependent on the goals that you have going in from a coaching perspective. Now, obviously, the traditional approach, the IP approach, generally speaking, is going to be top down. So the coach is going to just essentially teach you how to do something. Whereas an ecological approach, hopefully, should be more bottom up. So there is an overlying theme. There obviously is a skill component we're trying to work on, but everything that you do within that session is based on what actually happens in front of you, or what feedback the students provide, or how they are moving, how you watching them interact with that task. And it's so that's essentially it. And then obviously
so one, it's harder. Like teaching like this, because ultimately coaching is teaching and teaching is coaching.
Yeah.
It is harder to be reactive, but it's also easier in some sense, because if you've been proactive enough to create your session and try and funnel them towards specific parts of the game. So like you were doing seated guard, for example, you're not just chucking everyone in. I think this is still a thing people struggle with. You're not just chucking everyone in and going, oh, right, well, like monkeys hitting typewriters, let's just see if someone creates gold here. You're giving them aims, even if they're very broad, and even if people understand them differently based on what level of ability each of them has and their past experiences and the yada, 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 all that shit. But you're creating an environment where they get to figure stuff out, and then you as the coach get to go and see, is everyone failing in a similar way? Like, are there any trends here? Is there... Because sometimes I think that coaches, especially with the top-down approach, it makes it far too easy for people to do this, is they go, what did I struggle with? Well, for example, if you're Hodger Gracie, not a lot.
Yeah, not a lot.
Like, if you've ever seen any of his seminars, there'll always be at least one small woman who asks him a question and he just goes, that's never happened to me. And of course it hasn't, because through his experiences, he's never had that before. Now, he's very good. He thinks it through and figures it out for that person. But that's the level of understanding and skill that he has. The difference for the rest of us is you can't just go off your experiences and assume that's how everyone learns jiu-jitsu. You have to look at what are people doing in the room. So, like, if I taught history the way that I learned it, I wouldn't have done any fucking work, because I loved that. I'd have learned it however you handed it to me, because I enjoyed it that much. But if I then taught everyone that way, I'd have left so many people behind, because it required a really high reading age. It required an inherent passion for the topic that you just happen to have. You've no idea why, you just do. And I think sometimes people assume that the problems that they've had or the sticking points that they've had are going to be the same that everyone has, rather than... So I'm going to use a metaphor that was used with me on teacher training, is you should be spinning plates, not juggling balls. Because if you're standing at the front of the room and you're the fucking juggler, then everyone's looking at you, which is not the purpose of a teacher. If you've set it up, they know what they're doing, you've told them what the drill or game or whatever word you want to use to describe it is, the thing that they're off doing is, and they all understand it and they get what the purpose is and they're away and doing it, your job is to walk around the fucking room and see what people are struggling with and to see what people find difficult. And I think that gets lost because so many of us have grown up with coaches who don't go and walk around the room because they're also training. And as lovely as that is, and as much as I understand that some people need to use that approach, it's shit for teaching. You shouldn't be learning it at the same time as everyone else. You should be often learning it, definitely, because then you understand where people struggle, or all of the reasons that you don't want a coach who's never done jiu-jitsu before trying to teach you jiu-jitsu. Subject knowledge matters, whether we like it or not, because it allows you to plan, it allows you to progress, and it allows you to problem solve. But you should not be doing it live with everyone else. really, if teaching is your aim and their outcomes are the purpose of the session, you should at least have some time in that session where you're walking around the room and seeing what people are finding difficult and spinning plates. You know, you intervene with one person very gently with a pointer, or you tell them to reset in a different way, or you just give them a word of encouragement so they keep going because you can see they're along the right track, but they've just not committed, or they've just not had enough time there. Like, that's the job of a teacher. They're just quietly walking around the room spinning plates. Like, you think of the shitty magic trick of spinning plates. You're not the person holding it and balancing it. You're the person walking around just giving it a little shunt and going, right, now I can fuck off and let the stuff happen by itself.
Yeah,
and a lot of people aren't comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think you made a really interesting point at the start about how everybody is slightly different. And I think this is such an important correlation to make in jiu-jitsu, or important point to make, is I remember having one of the girls at the gym had been to one of Fion's camps. And again, this is no disrespect to Fion at all. But she sort of come back and she was like, obviously Fion had taught the sort of iconic Fion knee cut. And she sort of come to me and gone, I'm really struggling to do this knee cut like Fion. And I was like, well, you're not Fion. Like, why are we trying to do the knee cut like Fion? Now, this is where it raises an interesting point, because when we look at, again, this idea of, when we're talking about discussions from a theoretical standpoint in terms of these different approaches, one of the main arguments from a comparison standpoint is the sort of traditional approach assumes stability, so it assumes that there is actions that are all the same regardless of sort of individualism.
Yeah.
And this is a big flaw, because this is where it gets complex, because obviously there are actions which are similar across the board. Like, we know there are very effective ways. Using a knee cut is a very effective way of passing a guard. The problem occurs when you take out that element of individualism in terms of how that person comes to that realization on their own. And the sort of ecological approach takes the individual is a key part of that trifecta of an individual, an environment, and a task. And what we have to do from that perspective is, we know that a knee cut is an effective tool to use. We know that it's an effective movement solution, to use the correct terminology. But what we can't do is, we can't just tell a person to do it. They have to be able to organize themselves so that they can find their own way to do that. Like, me and you are completely different. We have different limb lengths. We might be different weights, heights, ages, injury history, different sporting backgrounds. We've got this category of things that make us different. Yes, we're both human beings. Yes, we're both men. Yes, we're of similar age, stuff like that. But we're still completely different. So the way that I go about solving a task is going to be completely different to how you go about solving the task. Our job from a coaching perspective, again, if we're looking at creating, again, a session designed based around knee cut. Now, probably, if you're using the true sort of ecological approach, you would never build a session around a knee cut. You'd build a session around sort of games based on winning the hip line or accessing chest to chest. Like, you'd use more general terms, but like, let's say for the sake of people listening, we're talking about a knee cut specifically. What we have to do is create an environment or a task that provides intent based around a set of variables that allow me and you to try to come to the idea that a knee cut is an adequate solution in order to do that. Because, if we look at it like biomechanically, what is a knee cut? Well, a knee cut is essentially you're at your furthest end range from a passing perspective without actually being outside the guard. So all a person's got hold of is the ankle line. You should, in theory, be chest to chest, or at least equal chest to chest, equal head to head position, and have some degree of upper body control. So that's the biomechanical reasoning. We're creating extension from the upper body and the lower body and filling that space using our own body. Now, that means fuck all if you can't orientate yourself in that manner. So we have to look at it from that approach. Now, I could teach you how to do a knee cut, but in the same way of the example I gave before, just because someone as like arguably the best female grappler in the world as Fionn teaches you, doesn't mean that you'll learn how to do that. Or doesn't mean that your body can contextually apply the relevant movements and actions to formulate as that a response to a problem. We have to be No, sorry, go on. I was going on. I forgot on one then.
So the knee cut's a really nice example, ironically, not ironically, but that was the first pass that ever made sense for me. And I don't think it's by accident, because my coach said to me, go and watch... God, I'm going to get it wrong now because they're not really on they're not really on YouTube anymore. But it was one of the old BJJ Scout. That's it.
Oh yeah.
Like, watch the BJJ Scout video on Leandro Lo's passing style. He's like, I think you'd enjoy it, and that was all he said to me. And he when I looked for the videos, he told me if I found the right ones, and I just watched them over and over again, and then he just let me play with that when I was sparring, and he didn't offer any. I think if I'd been doing something completely wrong, he might have said something, as in like literally not even standing in the right place. But being allowed to make those mistakes and practice it and fuck it up myself meant that I worked out how that suited me. And that was just from watching the principles of what is Leandro Lo how does he do it? Not he's teaching it and this is what I do. Just where is he standing? Right, I'll try and replicate that. When does he tend to seem to fire that technique off? Or when does he seem to pull the trigger rather than just standing deep in the position? Oh, in this one. And that let me work out what works for me rather than me just being told, here is how to knee cut. And I think I just think that's possibly why that one has sat so well with me, is because I was allowed to sit and experiment and figure it out for myself with very little intervention.
Yeah, so like if we give it, like, again, exploring this is quite I'm not actually sure of the correct answer with this, to be honest, because I'm unsure. Like, I'm not naive enough to think that watching video doesn't have an impact in the same way that like watching someone demonstrate a technique doesn't have an impact. I think what's quite clear is what in that example that you've just used, what occurred was you created some degree of intention. So you created an intent for you to go into a training environment and play around with a task.
Yeah, definitely.
And what that information does, so if we think about it just in the context of information, so somebody listening to this, if you're watching technique, obviously that just watching somebody do something is not enough for you to develop the skill. Again, we can talk about
it was the hard repeated efforts of just being put. It was because I was in a room full of people who like to play De La Riva, and I sucked at passing De La Riva. So it meant that I could spend quite a lot of time of just repeatedly standing up and trying to not get swept. Yeah. And then once I'd started to establish a solid position, then I could try and learn how to do the rest of the step. So it just so happened that it was almost a technique that was, sorry, not a technique, a situation that allowed me to slowly develop the process by myself. But I had all of that context of, I know this works, I know it works at the highest levels, and I have an idea of what it is he's physically doing, so I can just keep spamming that until something works or it doesn't.
So it's like the technical video or that acts as that initial point of information from an intent standpoint, and then you can then go into an environment, and what you're in theory doing is your body, your brain, physically, I guess this is elements of like motor learning and all that sort of shit, is you're then put into an environment where you have to gather all the relevant information about that visual stimulus that you initially had, so that set that intent. So your body's having to, like, again using technical terms, having to organize itself in order to meet the task related goal.
Yeah.
Now we can look at this from the perspective of a problem. So if you're a coach, like if you're looking at technique, what is the problem that it happens? So like Dave said, it's De La Riva, reverse De La Riva, those sort of problems, inside, outside guards. How do we solve that? Okay, well, we need to, we know that a knee cut is effective. We know it's a very effective guard passing technique. But knowing that that as a technique doesn't give value to the student, what we have to do is put the student in a position where they can almost come to that decision themselves. Now we can guide them, we can push them. That's what the constraint-led approach is about. It's about manipulating degrees of freedom so that they only have so many options to go at, and they can develop all that like contextual information through success, through failure, what they feel, what they see, what they smell, touch, whatever fucking sort of sensory input that they can gather, and they build that. Again, the technical term is affordance through a series of actions, and again, perception and action coupling, which is a complex topic we'll not go on today because we'll be all day. But like, that's what we want. We want to put you in an environment. Again, if you think about it, if you're listening to this as an individual who is just a trainer, you're not asked about coaching, but think about like any time you've learned something, like the example that Dave just used, is like, has there been a time where you've watched something, gone into an environment, and then it suddenly becomes part of your A game, if you want to use that terminology, of like, oh, I get this. This makes sense because you have that intention. So the video acts as the intention, and then you go into an environment where you have to practice it and fail at it and succeed at it, and different bodies, different individuals, different speeds, different paces, different resistance, and you're just gathering information. That's all we're doing, and there's a very complex series of events from the brain to your central nervous system to how we fucking move, essentially. But all you're doing is just orientating yourself around a generalized problem in a way. That's gone a bit off topic, hasn't it? We've got a bit
but I think that's important, because the risk of, I think it's something that you and I have talked about before, is how this is an era where, unlike when you and I both started, there is information everywhere. You can learn all the best stuff in the world in terms of jiu-jitsu, knowledge-wise, very easily, more easily than we could when we first started. It changed rapidly, but there was a time where you're like, DVDs, fucking hell, what are they? Like, I was talking to Chris Meyer, and he was showing me like books that he had back when he first started, and like DVD sets instead of BJJ Fanatics. And I think the counter problem has now happened, that there is too much information out there, and you get people who just collect techniques and they can't apply any of them because they've watched all the DVDs. Like, oh yeah, I know what J-point passing is. Like, oh great, but you can't fucking do it. So it doesn't, actually knowing the technical terms is useless if you don't actually apply it. And like, I didn't get good because I watched a video. I got good or okay at that pass because I repeatedly just ate shit in that position for a month solid. Because I knew something was at the end of the tunnel. I knew that there was possibility there. I knew it was, bits of it worked, and it kind of kept me going with it. Rather than, my alternative was I just got swept every single time. So anything was better than that, even if it just meant standing up for a couple of minutes before it happened.
Yeah, for sure.
That's where the ecological approach, I think, does really nicely, is it recognises it's about putting people into the positions they wouldn't normally put themselves in, to let them solve problems. And you might give them more or less contextual information to guide them, and that just allows them to figure it out for themselves and find the affordances that work for them. Because otherwise, like you said, if you're 6'4" ultra heavyweight and you're trying to tell a 55 kilo woman how to do a similar technique, it's going to be very different for the both of you. Maybe you will strike gold and you will be able to explain it in a way that makes sense to them, but the odds are fucking well against you in that situation. Whereas if you just create an environment where that person gets to be in that situation for a period of time, trying to solve the problem, they're going to do more learning in the 5 minutes of trial and error than they would in the 5 minutes of listening to you espouse the fucking virtues of whatever position it is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, when we talk about, like, there's a lot of, obviously from a session design standpoint, there's a lot of development that comes from coaching. It's so much more than just the sort of way that we've talked about it. It's that there's a lot of depth to development as a coach in terms of like the integration of how you apply this stuff and your understanding behind it. But obviously that takes time. In the same way it takes time for you as an athlete to learn a technique or a certain skill set or get better at something, it's the same within coaching. It's not just a case of like listen to a Greg Saunders podcast and go, oh, I know the ecological approach. Because there is more nuance to it than that. It is complex. Like I know people always say like you see it a lot online. It's like you get a lot of these fucking meatheads that are just like, oh, just train jiu-jitsu, and it's just like, yeah, but you're just too fucking thick to realize like the developments in training come from people being clever about it. Just because you can't pick up a fucking book and read about it, like most of the people making developments were just meatheads who learned to read. Like, that's all it fucking was. Like, it's like the old, how Neanderthals come out of the caves. You know what I mean? It's because someone worked out how to fucking chuck a spear. Like, development in training is going to take it's going to take someone probably making things overly complex for us to then bring it back to a point of being like, all right, well, this is the integration. But from a coaching standpoint, we have to go away and learn this stuff. It's so much more than just, this is game 1, this is game 2, this is game 3. But on a caveat to that, if you don't understand that, then a really simple way of starting this stuff is just letting them fucking practice the thing they're trying to get better at.
Yeah.
And it is sometimes just a case of like Dave said. Now, obviously, we talked about the reverse classroom model in older videos, but like, obviously you can't get everyone to watch a technique and then be like, right, we're going to do this. But sometimes it is just a case of like, can you set them objectives relative to a task? So if you don't know the ins and outs of the constraint-led approach, you don't know the ins and outs of invariance, you don't know all that stuff, but you know that they need to be good at knee cuts, you can just start with giving them intentions. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a starting point to begin with. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be bang on the money. You need a little bit of self-awareness to know that you're doing it, but the self-awareness is like, I don't know any better, which is fine. If you don't know any better, that's completely fine, because that's your starting point. But sometimes just giving them, like you said, intentions, like, can we get to a knee cut? We don't need to worry about the fucking invariance, but it's allowing them to play and discover and organize themselves. They're gathering that information, that haptic feedback of weight distribution and speed and all that sort of shit, how strong someone feels, and it's allowing for that element of variability between individuals relative to a task.
And also, like we've talked about previously, it allows the person to struggle. Because if you don't have any struggle, then you will not value that information. Your brain is not going to invest resources in solidifying the synaptic connections, in fucking integrating it into your working model. Like, it's not going to do any of those things if you didn't value the thing in the first place. And so it's why guys who get very good, and it is often guys, they get very good and then they try and explain it all to someone else, like, here is my model, and then they go, oh, why isn't everyone good? And it's because the process of you figuring it out and working it out was how you got to the thing that works for you. It wasn't that you stumbled upon the answer and now you can teach it to everyone else. And I think sometimes that's the bit that gets lost, is you need to let people have that experience for themselves. And the more, like, I see this whole model as literally, just because I'm coming at it from classroom teaching where this is widely accepted, no one in teaching would go, oh, you just got just learn history. No shit, really. Is that what we have to do? God, I'll just sit them in this room for 8 years and then it'll just magically happen. They'll produce the grand works of fucking... Anyway, it has to be more intelligent than that. Now, it doesn't mean that it has to be so hands-on and heavily involved that we are essentially orchestrating their every move, and you turn them into a whole fucking room full of yous. Like, my students would always ask me, oh, what do you think? And I had to be like, it doesn't fucking matter what I think. Of course I think I've got the answer. That's not how history works. Like, we need a variety of people writing in a variety of ways from a variety of perspectives, so that we might actually one day have a slightly more diverse canon of information that we can work from.
Yeah.
In the same way that you can't just create a room full of people who play your game and are the same size and weight and limb length as you and fuck anyone else that comes in through those doors. You have to be able to create situations where all you're really doing is trying to stack as many learning opportunities consecutively as you can in different positions, if you want to say positions, or solving different problems in the sport as you can in front of them as often as you can. And that's it. It doesn't, at its crux, yes, it's more complicated than that. Yes, go and read more widely. Yes, go and talk to other people who've applied this because they will do it better. But fundamentally, the whole approach is just trying to make sure that you're giving people the opportunity to figure shit out with a little bit of help or maybe no help, depending on who they are or the situation or whatever, as often as possible in a session, so that hour and a half that they have with you is as effective as it can be because they've had as much learning time as possible, instead of, oh, here, let's hear coach preach for 40 minutes and then I'll actually go and do sparring where I might figure some shit out, which is half the session wasted.
Yeah, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there, mate. I think like you said, there is some nuance to this, and I guess obviously when we're talking about session design, it does matter. But fundamentally, if you've got an hour and a half with a group of people, it's how can you expose them to as many learning opportunities as possible. Like you said, it's how we go about that is contextual in terms of like how do we manipulate certain tasks and constraints and goals, but it essentially that is what you're doing. You're giving the individual as much time as possible within an environment with a set of contextual problems that they have to solve. If we know that time is such a massive value factor in anything that we do, anything that involves learning and getting better at something. So the person who can accumulate the most amount of time, not just on one specific task in general, but against, again, that's the old repetition without repetition analogy, but how can we accumulate as much time against relative problems at varying degrees of, again, we'll use the term resistance, but in theory, all it is just like different levels of ability. And like, again, repeatedly try and solve the problems that lead to certain outcomes to develop a contextual understanding of the problems that they're trying to solve. Like, if we think about people who are like, again, we'll use the Fionn example because we've mentioned her today. Again, this is no disrespect to Fionn whatsoever. Fionn's knee cut is exceptional. She passes the best female guard players in the world using one specific technique. Is it that she has just repeated the knee cut over and over and again, or is it the fact that she's been able to replicate that in varying degrees of variability? Like, she's not just found a way to do the technique, she's found a way to do the technique against everybody. She's found a way, her body, again, her brain and her body, the various different systems within her body that operate together to create movement, have found a way that regardless of the problem in front of her, she can solve it using this set of actions. Now that doesn't come from perfect execution. That comes from applying it in a varying degrees of context. Because her, again, like, she's got that element of intention. She knows the direction. Now, Fionn probably doesn't give a shit whether we're talking about an ecologically in terms of the invariants that occur. All she needs to worry about is, can she fucking do it? Like, that's the part where we see the difference between coach and athlete, is because realistically, the athlete, whether we can talk about whether it's beneficial for an individual to know that or not, the athlete fundamentally doesn't need to know why. They just need to know how. And our job from a coaching perspective is, how can we give them the opportunity to learn how? And the answer is not through talking to them more. The answer is allowing them to fucking do the thing that they're trying to get better at.
Well, just to take it to like our day jobs, if you or I was to teach someone how to squat, are we going to give him a 40-minute lecture on fucking biomechanics and all the different approaches to squatting and what's the difference between a front squat and a goblet? No, because it doesn't fucking matter. You put the minimum amount of intervention that you can in and tell them, there you go, now do it. And you watch as they do it and you let them practice it and you play with the variables that you use to find the perfect, not the perfect, but a good enough solution for that person in front of you on that day in that environment. And then you build on that subsequently, session by session, time by time under the bar teaches you a lot. And it's the same with jiu-jitsu. Like, it's absolutely true that time is so key, but it's also not enough to just say you just need more time, because that is a cop-out from the coach developing situations to make you make the most use of your time possible. Like, both things are true. You can plan, you can be thoughtful, you can upskill yourself as a coach, and you can accept that the person who spent more time on it is likely to be better than the person who hasn't spent as much time on it. Like, there's that tale, like fucking, just to pull it back to Danaher, because that's who everyone loves. But not Gordon Ryan. Gary Tonin talked about how in the build-up to one of his matches, John basically just bullied him relentlessly, telling him that his front headlock sucked because he didn't have a guillotine. And so that's very, very technique specific, but what he's actually done there is, through winding him up, created a situation where Gary is going to repeatedly put himself in that situation against everyone in the room who deals with it in different ways, who rolls in different ways, who are different heights and weights, and is going to try and apply a very similar solution to every single person until he starts to get why. Like he said, he first started and it would work on one or two people, and then over time it was half the people, and then over time it was everyone. And it's still that process. Yes, as a coach, we can clear that up and we can create situations where we can make that happen. That's probably a bit more effective than just making fun. Or maybe that isn't what happened at all, but that's how Gary has perceived it. But it's that process of just spending time trying to solve a specific problem yourself, because you've been given that motivation, whether that's because someone's designed a game or a drill or whatever you want to call it to make you do that, or it's because you're at a very high standard and your coach has taken the piss out of you and you know that's not going to stop until you fix that problem. Both of them produce the same end result, which is someone repeatedly being in that learning environment until they start to find the solutions that work for them.
Yeah, 100%. And I think session design for me is such a fascinating thing, because when you watch, so obviously from, like you said, you mentioned the squat. Now, obviously, like, one of the things that we have to pay awareness to is decision making from a coaching perspective. So in theory, based on what we've said, if it's all about time under tension, in theory, you just make someone squat for an hour. But we know that that's probably not.
And then like, they never come back.
We've got fatigue to manage. We've got soreness to manage. We've got engagement to manage. We've got like all this different stuff. And that's exactly the same when it comes to jiu-jitsu. There are certain things that we have to make decisions based on. So like session design for me is like a really, really fascinating topic, because the way that we contextualize a training session can influence how an individual goes about interacting with that task. So like time's a really big variable which impacts how somebody interacts with a task. So to use an example, if like, let's say for example, like last night, the first sort of game we played was pretty much just a grip fighting game. It was about making and establishing dominant grip positions, whether it's inside or outside. If we did that for 10 minutes, the engagement would drop significantly because there's not enough for people there's not enough meat on it for people to get their teeth into. So we can't, even though time is obviously a massive factor, one of the interesting things that we have to do from a coaching perspective is understand the application of that. So we use that first game to draw attention to a specific element. But what also happens is that is a key variable that has to occur in every game that we play relative to that specific skill set.
Yeah.
So when we talk about time, it's understanding the context of time and the application of that time. So a really interesting way of doing things from a session design standpoint is building time as it goes on. So obviously the more complex the task, the more time and more variability that someone's going to have to navigate in order to be successful. So that same logic applies in terms of session design, because if you're like, again, if you're using, we're just going to forget the traditional approach of matters at this point. I can't be asked.
Fuck it.
Yeah, fuck it. If we're looking at it from like an ecological standpoint, but we're using it in the truest sense of the word, that time under tension is very effective, well, theory would dictate that we spend a large amount of time on one individual element. But the idea is those individual elements are always present. So as we sort of reverse engineer the skill set based on the variance that we need to accomplish, we understand that we're getting more time under that tension. But what in theory we're trying to get them to do is we're trying to get them to organize themselves without actually realizing that they're doing it. So like we draw attention to these key components, but in theory, by the end of the session, they're hopefully, now obviously it's not going to be perfect because skill is non-linear, and to expect somebody to nail something within 1 hour is an absolute fallacy. But hopefully by the end of that session, key components of those skill sets, whether it is winning grip fights, making connections and dominating those positions, that should sort of be happening without the student realizing they're doing it at this point, because you're drawing attention towards other areas of that skill set, and it becomes, again, to use that terminology, subconscious. But in theory, it is, because they're not having to think about it as much; they're just navigating a task. And
but we've all experienced that, whether it's in the traditional session or seminar session or whatever way you want to describe it, where someone will, if they're any good at designing a session, they'll start with that first step. Like it might be, you said you started with a game that encouraged people to just simply grip fight. Well, I imagine as you work through the session, you didn't go, right, and now we're going to start from, you've got those grips and that's that. Because why would you waste like a good minute of getting to have that grip fight in there again and again? By the end of the session, you've done, 4 or 5 rounds of grip fighting without realizing that you've done 4. You're only aware of the first one, and then the other 4 you just sort of had to do.
Yeah,
and
100%.
It's understanding that I think what people find difficult with this is it sounds like, to people who don't like the ecological method or don't like the way in which people explain it, it sounds like you're throwing everything out and just hoping people will figure it out as they go. And actually what we're saying is you have to carefully design with the outcome that you're looking for in mind. You just don't, it's like a magician. You just don't fucking give the trick away. You don't show them what's behind the screen. You let them work it out.
Yeah, so this is something that, because I'm a sad bastard and read a lot on this stuff, this is a really interesting thing that I've been delving into myself, is obviously from a coaching perspective. Now, I spend a lot of time, and again, this is not that I'm the gold standard, but something that's really important to me is I spend a lot of time trying not to influence how people interact with the task. And something that I've delving into a little bit more is, one thing that we have to understand is, whether we like it or not, if you're the coach, you are the individual. So people are looking to you for answers. Now, again, I work really hard trying not to be the answer to all questions, but unfortunately, I'm the person leading the class. So there's always going to be a bit of bias towards that. Now, one of the things that I realized recently is, if I'm explaining part of the training, whether it be a game or something like that, I've realized that if I demonstrate something, what do people then try and do?
However you've demonstrated
however I've just demonstrated it. So this is a really interesting factor in terms of that, the realization that within a session design, how you conduct yourself from a coaching perspective will impact how your students behave. So language is massively important. So there's loads of research. She's called Gabby Wolf, I think, but it's Wolf spelled LWOOF. LF. She's like, that seems to be, from what I can understand, like the lead researcher in this idea of like internal versus external sort of focus and language, and how the language we use can impact how somebody behaves. So again, if I use the word, let's say I was explaining again, sorry, I'll start that again. So like how we explain something will dictate how an individual orientates themselves. So again, this idea of I'm trying to think of an example here, but I've lost. So like the IP, again, another what I think is a fault of the IP approach is there's so much focus on like really specific gripping. So we're trying to you explain it to someone in terms of how they're going to grip and manipulate, as opposed to an action that they're trying to do, an external factor. So an idea of this would be, I'm trying to think of an example. I can think of it for like a leg lock. So I used the example again that I'm doing a shit job of explaining this. I do apologize. So like, for example, yesterday in the class, one of the language words that I used when we were looking at the leg lock is, how can I penetrate the inside? So I used a very specific verb to try and get them to fulfill an action, as opposed to being like, we want to we want to make this grip in this certain way. So we're trying to encourage them to think outside of themselves relative to the information that's present. Again, apologies for anyone listening. I've done a terrible job of explaining that. But this is something that's really important as well. So again, if I demonstrate, even if I'm not, I never use or try to never use technical terminology in a traditional sense when I'm demonstrating a game. But if I move myself in a certain way, I've got a whole room of people watching me who, whether I like it or not, I am the superior individual in that room because I'm the coach, whether I'm technically superior or not, but I'm the person who's talking. I'm that person. So what happens, whether they mean to or not, is they've been given a piece of contextual information that they've not sort of discovered for themselves. Not obviously necessarily this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just an important distinction to make. Is that we have to understand that we influence how students learn and how they interact, whether that's through how we communicate using language, or how we demonstrate something. So, funnily enough, I think I was listening to a podcast where who was talking about it. I can't remember who was talking about it, but they were saying how when they demonstrate something to do with a game, they do a really shit example, or they get or they get like 2 random white belts to demonstrate it, so that they do a shit job of it, and it has little influence in terms of how somebody then interacts. Now, there's no perfect method of doing this, but it's just something that's worth saying.
Just to take that from a teacher's perspective, I think that's a really nice example for a number of reasons. Because first off, you get those white belts up to the front and it's no longer intimidating to make mistakes. And that's really important. Second, you tell the whole room that like no one actually gives a shit how good your solution is to this, because I've just used 2 people who we all know don't understand how to solve this problem to give you the example. And then it does what you say, of it doesn't really colour, like no one else, no brown belts looking at it going, fuck, I'm going to solve it that way. And so it allows people that space. It's like, I was just thinking of one when you were talking about it, that the language really matters, and will drive the behaviour. Because if you're trying to teach someone to do this, and you tell them to, place your hand in the air above your head and then place your hand back in your lap, they're going to just sort of do it like that. And if you tell them to punch their fist in the air, you're going to get a very different reaction just based on that choice of words, whether you show them the demonstration or not. I was trying to be very careful I realised the choice of action that I chose there was not the best one. It's the history teacher in me God, no, don't do that. But the point being that just by changing the word from punch to place, it's 2 completely different outcomes. And until you start making mistakes like that, you don't notice it. So like the classic teachers one is never say to a kid, never ask a question you don't want an answer to. So never go like, oh, you're just not interested in learning, are you? Because the kid will go, nope. And then you're fucked. Whereas instead, you can use little tricks like you say, oh, I need you to do this today. Not I want you to, because I want you to allow someone to go, fuck off, I don't want to. They don't know what you need. So if you say, I need you to, then suddenly there's, it's not to say that there aren't still kids who turn around and go, get fucked, I don't care. But it allows a different solution to happen in a way that asking the other way doesn't, because it will just garner that like immediate knee-jerk, get fucked reaction. And it's one of those sort of nitty-gritty things that seems like it doesn't matter until you explain something badly in front of a room full of people and watch as they all fuck it up because you chose the wrong word for that day.
Yeah, for sure. And this is, it's just obviously one of a few things that obviously like nobody's perfect. Like this is where I said at the start, self-awareness comes into the mix. Like there is, yes, okay, there are coaches that are seasoned in terms of applying different methods. So the mistakes they make will be few and far between compared to somebody who's starting out.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest...
But they didn't start that way.
No, exactly. And I think this is something Ed Ingemelt says, to be fair, but like one of the key components of good coaching is self-awareness. Because even if you're doing something wrong, it's having the ability to know that you're doing something wrong and that it's a hole that you need to explore yourself. And again, like very similar to jiu-jitsu, whether you're an individual or a coach, I think that's an important thing. Self-awareness is important to realize. Sometimes that blind naivety is not always a good thing, because that's how people end up just doing the same shit over and over and over and over and over again.
If you want something to sorry to interrupt, but just if you want something to help you to develop that, the single most uncomfortable thing you can do that is guaranteed to make you a better coach or teacher is video one of your sessions and sit there and watch the whole thing back from start to finish with a pencil and a paper and just critique yourself. Because you'll notice you've got certain phrases you always fucking use. You'll find out what your teaching catchphrase is. You'll notice, do you mumble when people can't hear you? Do you walk around the room, or do you have one little corner of the room that you dominate and you never go anywhere else? And it's all of these little... it's completely separate from session design. It can very much help you with session design because you can watch it back and go, that didn't work. I put them in the wrong order. I should have tried it the other way around.
Yeah.
When you're first starting with all of this, it's very hard to both be in the moment and then also critically evaluate it later. Other people can do that when they're more experienced because they're not having to carry that burden of running the session and thinking about the session and how do I solve all of this, and you're sweating and going, oh my god, what's going on. Once you've done it enough times, you can just sort of, that bit happens, and then you can be thinking on it. Like when you learn to drive, you first learn to drive, you're like a sweaty mess because you think, oh my god, I'm going to kill everyone in this death box on wheels. But then as you get more competent, you can just start to think about, you can problem solve things in your life. Like people talk about important ideas coming in the shower or driving. That's because you've become accustomed to that. And when you're very early on, you're not capable of doing that. So actually videoing the session and making yourself watch it back will do huge things, because you'll see all of these issues that Andrew, for example, you're able to talk about because you've practiced this enough now that you get that feedback and you're self-aware. For people who find it a bit harder to be self-aware, that one can really kickstart the process as you video it and then cringe your way through the 90 minutes of hating every second. Yeah. And you can write it all down and see where the problems were.
And I'd also say if you're somebody who is listening to this, and whether you're an individual or a coach, and you feel like you're not doing a good job, I would say you're on the right track. The problem is with the people who feel, this is the issue, is if the problem is with people who feel like they're doing a good job, what it probably means is they're just copying. So they're just getting templates and they're just following a script. And they feel like they're doing a good job is because they're replicating somebody else's information. If you feel like you're not doing a good job, or you've got imposter syndrome or anxiety, it generally is a good thing, because it means you're uncomfortably trying to step out your comfort zone. You're trying to push.
You need a healthy amount of that.
Yeah, you do. Obviously, yeah. I mean, if you're doing an absolute stinking job, then maybe have a reflection. But like, I don't think it's a bad thing to be self-critical in terms of like you feel like you're not doing as good as you maybe are. Something that I try and do, even like, because I quite often leave the mat and I'll be like, fucking, I've done a stinking job there. But something that helps me a lot is I either look around the room or I'll have a conversation with someone coming off the mat. Because a lot of the time I can come off the mat and be like, fuck's sake, that was shit. I didn't like how I did that. That game didn't work. And then I'll speak to someone and be like, oh, it was mint that. Cheers for that. And I'm like, right, okay. Bare bones is as long as they've enjoyed themselves, I'm okay. I'm okay. Do you know what I mean? Like,
as long as I think that's a really important minimum standard. As long as you haven't made them hate jiu-jitsu, you've not fucked it. It's okay.
Yeah. I think we can widely agree whichever method you follow. I think we can widely agree creating a consistent, enjoyable training environment is one of the biggest factors to consider. So regardless 100%. Of your anxiety and self-deprecation and fucking imposter syndrome, if the people in the room are consistent and enjoying themselves, you're not doing a terrible job.
No. And I think to again take it back to classroom teaching, if you think back to the teachers and the environments that you enjoyed at school, they go, oh, you talk about who you had. But the reason that you liked that teacher is because you liked the environment they created.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. It might be that the room was quiet and everyone could just fucking get on with their work. It might be that that person was interesting and engaging and they created an environment that you thrived in. It's so important and so undervalued, especially talking about kind of this is going to sound unfair. I don't mean the ecological approach, but sometimes I think people put the cart before the horse, because if you haven't got the soft skills to create an environment that people like to come back to, then what the fuck are you doing? You could be the greatest, you could have the greatest literature understanding. You could, be able to talk with the PhDs on this topic. But if fundamentally people don't like being in the room with you, then this was a total waste of your life, because you can't apply it. You can't make it happen. The whole point of being able to do all of this is so that you can teach a room full of people. And if by trying to become good at teaching a room full of people, you create an environment no one wants to fucking be in, then you've just missed the whole point of what all of this is for. It should be engaging and fun and developmental.
100%, and that's a big thing. And like, we probably should explore a little bit more descriptive ideas as well for session design. We've been quite sort of general, haven't we? But I guess like there is a lot of context to this topic though. Like I think again, like I said, a big fascination for me is like, how do things impact the drill? So obviously one of the advantages that we have from like a strength and conditioning standpoint is understanding the integration of energy systems and the bridging that gap between sort of physical adaptation and sort of cognitive adaptation, if you want to use, or skill development, like, and how different, again, it's this idea of task demand, isn't it? And how we introduce technique, how do we introduce adaptations that we want to occur on, like, and how that impacts the task. So like a really simple example is like I always say is like, if you set a task, and again this idea of time, if it's something as simple as like pass a guard, right? Let's say we just use a general terminology. You've got like guard passing rounds. If you do it as a minute, that outcome is going to be very different from if you do it for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And this is an important relationship to understand, because we have to, as coaches, when we're designing the session, understand the impact that can have. Again, like if I tell you you've got 30 seconds to pass a guard, the output from an individual is going to be significantly different than if I say, right, you've got 30 minutes to pass a guard.
Yeah.
And I think it's, again, this idea of...
But,
sorry, I was just going to... Well, you speak, on. Dave.
So it's that... Yeah, the time is a really key variable there, because if you're, like you've talked about before, that an awful lot of the ecological approach is about putting people with in whatever way that you can, putting people in a situation that forces them to develop in a way that maybe they don't normally do. And so if you've got someone who's a very explosive, frenetic guard passing style, and you want them to develop some horrible, close, slow guard passing, give them a 15-minute round. They're not going to be fucking fast by the end of that. It just won't happen. And it's quite a blunt approach, but it can be what opens their eyes to like, oh shit, yeah, what if I am 6 matches deep in a tournament and I can't fucking prance around them like I used to? I need different solutions. And it can just be as simple as, because you might not have buy-in otherwise. They'll be like, oh, I can do this forever. I can do it to everyone in this room. Not realising that they might be up against a room full of people who are just as fast and frenetic as them. And they'll be knackered by match 3. That you just open the door to that possibility, and that can be enough to get people on board.
100%. And another really interesting manipulation is from a recovery standpoint and an energy management standpoint. Like, we often talk about, like, a differentiation that often doesn't get played is the impact of like intensity in a training week. So obviously we know that like hard training, you need intensity, you need that variability, you need that pace, that output, that movement. But we can't do that all the time. So we have to have this understanding of how the task impacts demand of the training session as well. So if let's say you've got a really hard session on a Monday night, on a Tuesday night, you're probably not going to want to go as hard because you need to recover and repair for the next whatever hard session it is, whether it's Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. So how can the impact of the task affect that? So can we use time domains? Like you said, can we use, it might sound daft, people might think, 20-minute round will be harder, but what does a 20-minute round force you to do? Slow down. So there's less intensity. Is it that we create a task where the variability is much lower? So it could be like, you can use, again, I use open and closed constraints. These are not technical terms within the research. These are just the ways that when I started reading and learning this stuff, categorized training. So a closed constraint is something where the amount of options an individual has are very limited, or the amount of information that they have is limited. So it could be something as simple as like backgrounds. Can you stay and maintain a back control, or a mount, or something like that? And then a more variable position might be like open guard passing, because there's a fucking shitload of stuff that can occur. So you can use that to manipulate intensity within your sessions, depending on the skill response that you want, but also depending on the physical stimulus that you want, or the residual fatigue from a session. So it's like it's really interesting how these tiny little things. Music is massive. If I want people to go intensity, so I want people to go hard, like, more often than not, it's something fucking hard and heavy, whether they like it or not. Whereas if I want to bring the intensity down, you could play like low level techno, stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? Like, you'd be surprised how much the music in a speaker, coming out of a speaker, can impact the intensity of a room. Like, these are such a little variables, and they might sound minute. You might be listening to this going like, what the fuck's he on about? But like, you'd be really surprised at how they can impact like your body language as a coach. If I'm like standing on my feet and I'm irate and I'm moving a lot, it builds atmosphere, it builds intensity. If I want to motivate people, we can give them a lecture about standards and then let them fucking have a scrap for an hour. Whereas if I want a much lower session, I'll tend to sit down. I'm more chilled. Do you know what I mean? Like, these little things that can impact how a session and how an individual impacts a task. Like, you think about like, how do you exercise? If you stick a motivational video on in your head, like what were the old ones we used to listen to in rugby? Like, there was a really famous one. It was like, when you want to succeed as much as you want to breathe. That was the quote, and it was absolute bollocks. But like, obviously, you come out of that, you're like, yeah, fucking hell, like banging your head against the wall, like ready to take someone's fucking head off. But like, do that compared to like, I don't know, listening to the Harry Potter audiobook. Your energy towards something is going to be significantly different, isn't it? So it's like, obviously that's got fucking nothing to do with like session design, but like, these little variables can impact the overall outcome of your session and how the individuals in the room interact with the task. So it's like, as a coach, it's leveraging the advantages that you can. And
I think to just to link it back to the point that you made, I think it's also recognizing like, how can you make an intense session an intense session, and how can you avoid making a less intense session an intense session by accident? So let's say you've got competition sparring, or like wrestling and then competition sparring, or wrestling then open mat, or you know, you've got a day that you know is like, that is probably our hardest session of the week. Everyone comes away from it fucked. Like, some people avoid it because they don't like hard work. you want to make sure that session, you could add like heavy music to that session and it probably wouldn't do any harm in terms of it's not going to lead to lots of people struggling to recover week on week. Yes, they might feel a bit more trashed the next day, but they've usually got a couple of days before the next session, they've got space. If you then take what's normally quite an easy session and you bang on like heavy music and rant at everyone about standards, then suddenly you've created two hard sessions. Maybe they're close to each other without meaning to. You have to accept that there's going to be ebb and flow in the way that you design your sessions across the week. Because if you're going 100% all the time, you're actually going 50%. Because you until you have done actual 100%, you don't know what that is. And you can't pretend to yourself that that's what you do every single day.
And it's important, like in terms of like, it's an important distinction to make in terms of how many sessions a week you're coaching as well. Like,
yeah.
If you've got 6 sessions a week to go at, the integration of stuff that you can play with is going to be far different from someone who like teaches 2 sessions a week. So like, I always say like, there's a lot of stuff that I would like to do, but I only have 2 sessions a week with a group of individuals. I have to try and make decisions relative to that room over 3 hours of coaching.
Yeah.
So if that was compared to like a full timetable, the integration of session design is going to look significantly different. So these are where the decisions have to be made. And like you mentioned at the start, which is a really good point, is like you need a reason why you're doing things. It's such an important thing to have. It's not just, Sin Rafa Mendes post it on Instagram. It's what is the reason why you're integrating that? Like whatever the methodology you use, both of them have got advantages, but it's understanding the why you're using it in that way. That's the key factor. Why you're manipulating a variable.
Yeah, exactly. But so if we talk about kind of what would then traditionally be like the third set part of the session, which would be the sparring, whether that's positional into full, whether that's just full, whatever, that's why the shape of the session changes as it goes along, because the sparring is going to be the most complex and the most chaotic and probably the most fatiguing. Like compared to, even if you're using a full ecological method where you're very comfortable in kind of manipulating the variables to encourage people to use certain solutions, that's still going to be, let's say you did your grip fighting early on, that's not going to be the same as someone doing the full sort of back and forth towards the end of the session. They're not going to be the same at all. And that you're managing physical and cognitive demands. So you want your cognitive stuff early. So the things they find difficult, the getting them outside of their comfort zone, the forcing them to solve problems that they don't normally solve in a way that they don't normally solve them. That's high cognitive demand. When you get to the sparring towards the end, that's going to be, I'm running out of battery. That's going to be where you are not pushing that as much, because you're going to let people solve the way that they normally solve. And some people will continue to make it a high cognitive load session and will put themselves outside of their comfort zone and be able to eat shit for the remaining time. And others will fall back on their A game or their what they know are relatively stable solutions to the problems because they're fatigued. They don't want to continue that high cognitive demand approach, and some people just can't maintain it for extended periods of time, especially if they're new to the sport. So they need that space to also, even if we just think of it in terms of enjoyment, well, why do they enjoy the sparring at the end? Because they get to do the shit that they like doing, and that's often because it's less cognitively demanding.
No, 100%. You just get to switch off, don't you? And just experience, don't you? It's like that's the bit we're all here for. So I mean, and again, it's understanding that limit. Like sometimes, not that I'm the gold standard, but obviously the room that I've got is where I gather all my information from. So, like, there are times where we do something and I can just see straight away after about an hour the heads have gone. I've given them too much to think about. Then it's like, right, we're just going to roll here. Like, we'll just do some rounds. Obviously it's not a lot, but it's like we'll finish the last 15 minutes with 3 5-minute rounds. Now, generally, we never do 5-minute rounds. Very rarely we'll do just a 5-minute round, a minute's rest, 5-minute round, a minute's rest. But if I can see that their heads are pickled, then I'm just like, right, just go. Whereas sometimes, sometimes we don't, like last night, we didn't do any live training, like non task orientated training. It was all to do with the skill because they were doing really well. There was loads of interaction, and they were engaging with the task, so it doesn't need it. Like and that's, I think that's where this idea of session design comes from. But like fundamentally, that all is based off the initial target point of the session. I think one of the limitations, again, one of the criticisms that the traditional approach gets is it's like, we'll drill and then, all right, fuck off, do what you want to do.
Do whatever.
Whereas with the more ecological approach, it is all individual based. So you're making decisions relative to the information, that live information that's coming from the mat in front of you. Is it a case that we keep pushing the thing that we do, we keep tweaking and changing, or is it a case that we just fuck it off and just give them a break? Like, it's I guess in a way it's like the equivalent of I'm trying to think of an example of teaching, but it's almost like finishing a lesson early and letting the kids go and play outside. In a way, like
I never did that.
No. But no, like that's the example.
Yeah. Or sometimes, and this is, I don't know if you've noticed this with coaching, but sometimes giving people space away from whatever the topic is lets them actually understand it better. And people get very irritated with this because they're like, no, the more that you do it, the better you get. Now, I would argue they don't know anything about interleaving or the importance of complexity and all these other sort of nerdy teacher terms. But if you give someone the cognitive space to process it, like just in terms of our brains, our conscious experience is so little of what our brain actually takes in. Like what you or I can explain, describe, blah, blah, blah. It's fuck all of what comes in. Like, I don't know how my body maintains blood pH, but it fucking does it. And it's been doing it for the last however long we've been talking. It's recognizing that some of what our brain does is about giving it the space to just let it do its fucking job. And sometimes that means you do the session, you see, like you said, their head's pickled and you just go, fuck it, whatever. And sometimes it's you move away from the topic and then you come back to it a week later and suddenly everyone in the room gets it, or that whatever wasn't a solid solution for them has now become a solid solution because their subconscious has slowly stored that. Well, I don't know exactly how all the processes work. I'm not a neuroscientist. But what I mean is, from my perspective as a teacher, there were kids who we would leave a topic alone. We wouldn't cover it for a few weeks. It would then pop up in a quiz weeks later. And suddenly a kid who was sat through the whole thing going, what the fuck are you talking about? Goes, oh, right. Yeah, that thing. Cool. Yeah. I had one kid that I taught through the whole of A-level, and literally a week before the exam, I'd been teaching him how to write an essay and how to get better grades on that essay because it's boring, but on the mark scheme, there was a very specific mistake you could make that would cost you massively. And the week before the exam, he went, oh, so if I just do another paragraph, even though I haven't finished it, and there's more to the argument, I get better results. I was like, Jesus fucking Christ, yes. I've been telling this to you for nearly 2 years. But he just needed that space of not being told it for it to just go, oh, it's there.
Yeah, and I think
people don't like to hear that that's sometimes part of the process.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, again, from an individual standpoint, this is maybe where you're an individual, I think it's important to understand the way that you work. Now, like, I'm not talking about, like, what people think it is. Like, when people are like, well, I just do this. And, like, no, it's like, actually figure it out. Do you know what I mean? Like, and, like, somebody, like, obviously for me, for example, like, when when I'm looking at these sort of topics, like, I'm not one of these people, like, we talked about this prior to coming on to going live, but, like, we talked about reading. So, like, I'm not one of these people who can consistently just sit and read, like, academic literature. I can't do it.
No,
I can do
me neither.
I can do a block, and then I need 3 months to go and practice it and process it, and then I come back to it. Whereas some people who are more academically inclined will be able to just, like, sit at their laptop or whatever every night and just work their way through literature, just work their way, whatever it is, like reading, whether it's like non-fiction, self-help, all that bullshit. Like, I need a bit of, like, fiction. I need a bit of, like, escapism from the world in terms of, and that allows me a lot of time, like you said, the cognitive space to then, when I come back to something or when I see something in the gym, I go, oh shit, I see that makes sense. But again, that's about finding ways to discover it for you. Now, and again, this is the same context. It's like we're not expecting everyone to be very academically inclined. There is a certain level of academia and theory that I think is important for all coaches to develop. But it doesn't have. You don't have to be like you're not like going doing a PhD on it. You just need enough to get by. But it's understanding the context of your decision. Again, to go back to this general principle that we talked about, that you mentioned at the start, is that it's having enough understanding that you understand the consequences of the actions that you put in place.
Yeah.
And having the self-awareness.
Did they do what you were trying to get them to do?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is an interesting...
What I mean is, without you having to tell them to do it.
Yeah. And obviously, again, like...
More important... Well, but the other bit is, and without you making the drill or the game, or whatever context we want to fucking use, I say drill because in rugby, a drill is a variety of things, not just like holding someone's arm and pretending to do arm bars. Does it stick? Like, is it a thing that actually, like, does the drill represent what you want them to do in the sport, or have they just got good at the drill? Because that's the other risk, is that if all you ever do is that sort of, it's why you still have sparring. It's why you still have that in there for different approaches. Because if no one ever uses the solution that you thought they'd all got really good at, then clearly they just got good at the drill.
Yeah.
And sometimes that won't reveal itself to you until later.
That was something I was going to mention, which is a really interesting topic, is how, because skill itself, or again, learning, whether it's cognitive learning is in terms of like academic, or whether it's like motor learning, sort of completing motor tasks, skill acquisition, it's non-linear. So we have to be able to judge as a coach when we're looking at the end of a session, whether you're using ecological or an IP approach. How are we making that assessment from a coach perspective in terms of an individual's ability to actually develop that skill? So if, let's say, for example, we're putting in place a set of games, by the end of the set of games, they'll be showing representation of that skill. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they've developed that skill to a point of applying it significantly within a representative environment, which is why it's important to define a representative environment for an individual. But it's a fine line between them actually developing the skill and or just learning to complete a series of tasks. I think we've lost Dave on the podcast, so we'll probably try and draw this to a close in a minute. But that's an important distinction to make, nonetheless, in terms of that, because when we're assessing an individual's ability, he's back. He's back.
Run out of battery.
When we're assessing, and what I was just saying, Dave, to catch you up, was that it's an important, it's quite a difficult distinction to make as to whether someone's actually developing the skill or, like you said, learning to just complete the tasks, because skill itself and that development is very non-linear. We can't really define the point where someone does something. It's going to, again, this is the idea that it will emerge under a set of task conditions. It's not just as simple as like them getting through a session. The session obviously is that vessel for that development. But what are we looking for? Like, when I'm watching a session, I'm not looking to see them do a perfect example. If anything, I almost want it to be quite messy, because it means that they're actually just trying different shit. Whereas, like, if we're looking at a perfect example at the end of a session, more than likely they're just learning to do the task rather than actually develop the skill. So we almost want that element of messiness. But yeah, so that's an interesting thing. And obviously it's difficult to define like where that point is occurring. It's why it's important to use elements of testing. Now, we're not actually testing, but like that's why competition's really good, is because it puts them in an environment that forces that. It's like a stress test, isn't it? It's forcing them to show that element of contextual understanding relative to a skill. You'll have to cover me for 2 seconds, Dave. I'm going to piss my pants.
So there's like a nice point that just came into my head while Andrew was talking, was if you pressure test something, then competition is useful because it allows you to see, does that person actually do that in a different environment against someone that they've never trained against, etc., etc., etc. Now, there's enough things around competition that mean that can also go wrong. So it could be as simple as you take them to an open mat, you make them roll with someone they've never rolled with before. You see what they do against the new person who's turned up, who used to train somewhere else. All of those things can be used to see whether someone has actually begun to develop the skill, or whether they've just got good at solving the problem in the games or drills or sessions that you've given to them. But competition is key because it's relatively consistent. It gives, if you can do that under some of the most stressful conditions that you can do that in, then you know that skill is there. And really, for most of us, what we're trying to do is develop people who can go and compete and do well, and therefore the competition kind of acts as the gold standard. If they can do it in competition, they can do it. Like, where else are you expecting them to? The downside to that is, or the counter to that is, we all know people who can demonstrate a skill, who can drill it, who can show you it. Oh no, here's how you want to do that technique, or here's how to do an armbar. I saw this variation or whatever. And then you watch them roll, they never fucking do it. Like, you want the person who actually does the thing that they're trying to tell you about. You don't want to learn half guard from someone who never fucking plays half guard, unless they caveat everything that they're teaching about and everything that they're designing their session around as like, I'm trying to give you the opportunity to figure this out. It's not my main area, so I don't know a lot here. Like Andrew was saying, you're trying not to influence it, but we're not trying to produce people with coaching who are those guys who are like, here's everything about this position that I never play and never do. Because if you never see someone actually doing it in competition or doing it while sparring, then they don't have that skill. So why would you want to go and learn a skill from a person who doesn't have the skill?
Yeah, it's that debate between knowledge and skill, isn't it? It's knowledge does not equate to skill. Having a good breadth of knowledge is an important factor, because it can give you the potential to create, again, these ideas of contextual application, but it doesn't always correlate with being able to execute the skill. Being able to like list off series of DVDs from Fanatics is great, but if you can't apply it in a representative environment, it doesn't mean anything. And I think it's, again, this is slightly off topic away from individual session design, but in terms of an outlook from a coaching perspective, and it matters for the coaching session design, because it's a really good way of gathering information relative to your students. But it's important to try and encourage students to step into an environment that's representative of their development, whether it is just going to another gym's open mat. Obviously, in an ideal world, it would be a competition, because it's about, like you said, it's about as good as we can get from a stress testing standpoint. But it is just encouraging individuals to apply themselves, even if it's just a case of picking harder rounds in the gym. Like it's just, we're getting that element of stepping out of that comfort zone and applying themselves in an environment that is going to force them to try and apply the development in an environment that is going to force that organization in its most representative environment.
Yeah. No, I think that's, to be honest, I think that's a nice way to end it, because ultimately the session is going to build towards some form of sparring more often than not, especially unless you're incredibly well versed in ecological approach. And even then, it's not going to look too dissimilar to what people would call positional sparring, which is why so many people fall into that trap of just assuming that eco means positional sparring. And that's where the kind of feedback lies. Because you might have created, like we said, a room full of people who are fantastic at doing the game or the drill or whatever you designed to get the outcome. But then if they don't go and actually intuit that and demonstrate it themselves in other circumstances, then even if the skill is there, they're not using it. So it's not been that helpful.
Yeah,
and I think want to see them actually choosing it.
Like you said, I think that's a good way to end it. Is like, session design is not about individual factors. It's not about just picking a random thing and just showing it to a group of people. Session design is about organizing a period of time around a relative set of skills and information that are going to benefit the development of those individuals. It's not random. It's everything is coming off those individuals. It's concepts and skills and heuristics and movements that are going to facilitate them to be capable and adaptable, robust problem solvers over periods of time. Not just in that individual element. It's compounding interest. That's what we want from a session, is are those integrations going to compound over time and lead to good, capable grapplers? And from a coaching perspective, having an understanding of that representativeness, but also having an understanding of how that compounding effect can occur and what's the best way that we can effectively use that time to aid the development of those individuals.
Yeah. And also being self-aware enough to understand that you're going to fuck it up every so often.
Yeah.
And that there's nothing wrong with that. The only failed session is one where you've made them hate it. And I would argue even more importantly that you learn nothing from as a coach. So if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again, then you're not necessarily getting any better.
Yeah.
If you keep doing something similar over and over again and you're taking that feedback and seeing what works, that's great. But you have to be prepared that that session you spent 4 hours planning would go to shit in seconds.
Yeah.
And if it is happening, like you said, don't be afraid to just kind of not chuck it out of the window, but be ready to adapt if you need to. And if that means you've got to chuck it out of the window and do something a bit more traditional that people would frown at you for using, then if it means you don't lose the room, that's more important than you create a room full of people who think that approach you used is fucking bullshit.
100%. I think that's a very good way to summarise, Dave. Considering we're nearly at the 2-hour mark, it's probably best to call it short there. But so thank you for everyone who listened. As always, obviously, if you've made it this far, we do massively appreciate it. As always, social media mine is Brotherhood Performance. Dave's is Get Strong, Roll More.
Get Strong. Roll More.
Roll More. Obviously, we have the YouTube channel for the North South podcast for those of you for some reason who would like to see our faces communicating. That is obviously available on Spotify and all. For audio, I think Spotify actually has video as well now, doesn't it? I think so you can watch us on Spotify as well. No, I don't. I'm not sure.
You lucky sausages.
Yeah. But yeah, we appreciate it as always. Obviously, as always, if any questions, any feedback, our inboxes are open. But yeah, appreciate it. And until next time, we shall see you in a bit.
Yeah. Thank you, buddy. All right. Bye.
Pleasure. Take it easy.